Hello everyone, welcome to IMPAKT Festival and to this session that is called Augmented Cities, Data and Public Space. My name is Marina Otero and I work at the New Institute as Director of Research and I'm also an architect. Today is a very great day, so let's try to overcome it with a vibrant discussion with our guests, and also I hope that you participate in the discussion very actively. I also try to overcome the gray day with my sweater, bringing a little bit of light, but I will need your help during the panel discussion so we can really have a conversation. So yeah. Data and public spaces. So when we use these two terms together, we generally also include the notion of smart cities that is increasingly used by corporations, governments, and I don't know anymore if we know what it means or what it brings. The idea of smart cities, the notion is to introduce sensible technologies that will collect enormous amounts of data from citizens, but also from urban infrastructures. Then this data is used to enhance quality, performance, interactivity between different urban services, but also it gives the possibility to the states and other structures of power to centralize information and to develop activities of surveillance and militarization of the public space. Collecting data is not necessarily harmful, but we have to be aware of the policies and power games that are at play. In the way in which states and structures of power collect data, it is also visualized the violence inherent to the exercise of power and the ways in which these structures of power undertake actions that are meant for our protection, but also inevitably for the destruction of some of the questions that make possible our coexisting and living together in urban space, that is freedom and political action. To counterbalance this situation, many different artists, designers have created counter-narratives and actions, technologies that aim to bring all the ideas of what the public space is at the intersection between the physical and the digital. And today we are also going to have guests talking about these technologies and these ways of social critique and activism. So to summarize, we are going to talk about smart cities, we are going to talk about developments, policies, but also counter-narratives to the notions that are permeating policy and a lot of developments in the private industry that partner with the state also in creating these databases of our cities. I have three fantastic guests, and I'm going to introduce one by one. They will present one by one, and then I will invite all of them to have a conversation with me and with you. Our first guest is Albert Meijer. He is Professor of Public Innovation at Utrecht University. He studied chemistry at the University of Nijmegen and communication science at Wageningen University. In 2002, Meijer received his PhD at Erasmus University in Rotterdam for a thesis on parliamentary and legal accountability in the information age. Since February 2002, Meijer works as an associate professor at the Utrecht School of Governance. He teaches public administration and policy sciences at the bachelor and master level. He does research on technology and governance. Please join me in welcoming Albert Meijer.
Thank you very much for this very, very kind introduction. And I must say, for me, it's a great honor to be speaking here at this very interesting festival. I must say, as a professor of public innovation, I feel a bit intimidated by all these sophisticated and flashy presentations that I've been seeing here. So I hope you will bear with me with my presentations a little bit simpler and more basic, but I hope to compensate that with the quality of my line of argumentation. My message for today is really that the algorithmic city requires innovative forms of collective decision-making to establish what I call the legitimate data polis. I think in contrast with some of the other people here, I do not see power as something that is dirty or should be avoided. I think what we need to do is establish legitimate authority structures. And there are some really important challenges now that we're facing in this information age, but I would like to talk to you about what these challenges are and how we can go forward to establish these legitimate structures of authority. Algorithmic city is the theme of this panel. Smart city has also been mentioned by Marina. And the algorithmic city, as I see it, can really be understood from an input, throughput, output perspective. In the sense that it's about collecting data, processing the data, and using the data for interventions. And here on the slide, you'll see, for example, the example of mobility systems, intelligent transport systems. And then the idea is if we can collect good information about mobility in cities and process the data to find better ways to regulate traffic streams in a city, then we will find forms where there will be fewer traffic jams, where people will find it easy to find parking places, and that will have more efficient mobility systems, which in a way seems to be a good thing for everybody, because nobody becomes happy from traffic jams, or nobody really enjoys driving around the block several times looking for a parking spot. So it seems to be quite interesting if those problems could be solved with these new technologies. At the same time, we have to realize that the city is about much more than just traffic systems. And the big question here is whether this perspective on regulating these traffic systems, is rich enough to understand the urban dynamics. And for that reason, I would go one step further than the simple input, throughput, output perspective on the algorithmic city, and present what I call the governance perspective. I'm a professor of public management. I work at a school of governance, so governance is really our perspective. And in this one slide, I would like to briefly present to you what I mean when I talk about the governance perspective. If you want to talk about different perspectives on the smart city, the dominant perspective seems to be the perspective of the engineer, the rational perspective, the engineer that wants to calculate how information systems can help to solve crime problems, create better mobility systems, etc. On the other end, there's the perspective of the political scientist, which is probably also very often the perspective of the media critics that will be speaking at this festival. And from this perspective, it's really about the politics and the power structures and the power that influence the outcomes. And in that perspective, the outcome of these of the smart city is determined by who has most power and who manages to dominate the smart city game, as you could call it. And from that perspective, political scientists would argue that decisions about transport systems are always political because, well, to mention just one simple thing, there are quite substantial differences in the idea whether these mobility systems should be about private cars that enable individual transportation or whether we should aim for public transportation for everybody. So that's the perspective of the political scientists. And as governance scholars, we sort of try to combine these two logics. And our basic assumption is that we need to find forms of what we call networked collaboration between different stakeholders in the city. And the idea is that, of course, there are differences in power positions, there are different values, there are different interests, but there are also shared interests, and there are shared perspectives on problems. And the challenge in our cities is to find good ways of dealing with these problems, taking all these differences into account. So from a governance perspective, a smart city is a collaboration between scholars around data systems. And in my own work, I've introduced the concept of the data polis to understand this form of collaboration. I use the form data polis because I think a term like smart city is much too normative. I've been talking to many local governments in Netherlands and all around the world, and there's actually no local government that wants to be a stupid city, which is probably not very, very surprising, but it does highlight that it is a very normative term. It's something that everybody wants to be. Whereas I think as academics, we need more neutral terms that can help us to understand what's going on. And with the term data polis, I want to highlight that the classical idea of the polis, the place where citizens live together, have individual interests, but also collective interests, and have developed forms of collective decision-making, needs to be translated to the modern day age of the data polis. And in that sense, there's the data polis works actually in two ways. On the one hand, these the forms of the collective decision-making that we've developed in our polis determine what kind of data structures are being developed, because the local governments have a large influence on developing and regulating these data systems. The amount of leeway that we give to private corporations very much influences what kind of data systems are being influenced. So the data systems that are being created in our cities now can be understood as resulting from the current power positions in the data polis. At the same time, the data systems also can change these power positions, in the sense that data increasingly determine what is seen as real in the city. So citizens that are able to collect data about a certain issue may be able to put that issue on the agenda and may be able to influence processes of collective decision-making. And in the Netherlands, we had a discussion about the level of noise around our airport, Schiphol. And the noise net that was developed by citizens was a very strong intervention in this decision-making process, and citizens managed to influence this decision-making process by setting up their own data infrastructure. So in that sense, it's a recursive relation between the social structures that exist in these cities and the data structures that are being developed. And in this in these developments that are going on, I think the crucial question is not so much can we limit power or can we do away with all these things that we do not want. I think, at least from my perspective, the more interesting question is, can we develop legitimate forms of data polis? And with legitimate, I mean that it's a form of authority that's accepted by the people and seen as correct, or seen as just, as it's sometimes called. So can we establish institutions, decision-making processes, etc., that are seen as legitimate? I think that's the key challenge. And I would like to make that more specific by highlighting three specific challenges that we're facing in the data polis. And there are more challenges, but I singled out these three because I think they make the key problems very, very tangible. The first one is the data collection challenge. As I said before, and as I'm sure many people have been telling you at this festival, the smart city is very much about the readable city, about setting up all these sensor systems to read human activity, to read the activity of cars and other objects. So it's very much about collecting information about what's going on in the city, based on the idea that collecting more information results in better decisions. So the challenge here is to organize modes of data collection that are effective for tackling problems, but respect the privacy of citizens. And one concrete example is the Stratum's Eind, a street in Eindhoven, where they collect a lot of information about what's going on in the city to manage the crowd on that street. But at the same time, you can ask the question: do we want government to collect all this information through cameras, through Mac readers, etc., to manage the crowd? Do we see that as a legitimate form of crowd management in this area or Eindhoven? Or not? That's a first challenge. A second challenge is what I call the data visualization challenge. We talk a lot about collecting the data, using the data, but visualization actually plays a key role in the impact of these data systems on decision-making processes. And this here is an example of a crime map of Daytona Beach in the US. And the crucial issue here is, can we find forms of visualization that facilitate debate with insights while not limiting it by leaving out crucial perspectives? And that is quite complicated. That's quite a challenge for these visualizations, because what we often see in crime maps is that they highlight forms of crime that are well registered, such as breaking into cars or breaking into houses, whereas other types of crime, such as domestic crime, are not well registered and therefore do not show up in these visualizations. So what we visualize and how we visualize is very much a challenge. And a third challenge is what I call the data access challenge. There's a lot of discussion about open data, closed data, semi-open data. The example here is from the province of Groningen in the northern part of the Netherlands. There's a lot of discussion about whether all this information about earthquakes should be made accessible to citizens. In my own research, I previously looked at the open data about dangerous locations. That was just after the firework factory exploded in Enschede in 2000. And then people said, how can it be that we do not have information about these firework factories? We should have access to the data about these dangerous locations. But then 9/11 happened in the US, and the argument was reversed, and people said, how can it be that we should not make it too easy for these terrorists to have information about all these dangerous locations in the country? So there was two types of logic that both make the same sense, seem to make sense, but it ran in the same direction. The fireworks explosion seemed to suggest that we should make information more easily available for citizens, whereas 9/11 seemed to suggest that there were good reasons to keep certain information from the public. So that's again a challenge. And what I would like to highlight is that these challenges we cannot formulate simple solutions to these challenges. What we need is legitimate forms of collective decision making. And that brings me to the crucial role of democracy, and that's a big topic, and I think I have about 3 minutes left, or 2 minutes left even, so there's no way I can discuss all the elements of democracy. But I would like to highlight a few challenges and opportunities. The opportunities are actually quite well also discussed here. We've been talking about artists that create new forms of access, new sense of ownership. In Amsterdam, we talk about we own the city, democratic innovation. I could probably talk about that more in a panel later on. But there's also some key challenges. I like to say platformization is probably quite well known. Passivization is what I would call citizens are something that are increasingly being read instead of being talked to. So that's an interesting thing. Governments seem to find it easier to read our social media messages and on the basis of that distill our opinions than to talk to citizens. So I find that a big challenge as well. So there are some opportunities and challenges, but the key overall challenge is to develop forms of democracy that help us to establish this legitimate data polis. Because in the end, the data polis is more what I would call future making. It's about talking about the future of our cities. In these future cities, institutions will play an important role. Structures of authority will play an important role. We have to develop the right forms of democracy to establish these structures of authority that are legitimate from the perspective of citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Albert, for your presentation. We posted very important questions on the table already. I want to introduce our second guest, is Judith Bihr. She works as curator at CKM, Center of Art and Media in Germany. She studied literature, fine arts, and media studies in Germany and Egypt, and graduated with a Master's of Art. Later, she completed her PhD on contemporary Egyptian art. Her thesis was published recently under the title Patterns of Ambivalence: Subversive Practices in Contemporary Egyptian Art. She focuses her research on media studies, global art history, and postcolonial studies, with a special focus on the Middle East. Please, a warm welcome to Judith.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and special thanks to Jasmin Keskintepe. I'm very happy to be here. And my talk today will focus on augmented reality art and its subversive potential when it comes to rethink our concepts of public space in our digitized world. So it seems that augmented reality applications are conquering our everyday lives, and not least since the immense success of Pokémon Go 2016. And they are influencing also our perceptions of urban spaces by linking virtuality to reality and thereby creating a digitally enhanced or augmented view of our urban environment. And why augmented reality by itself, the technology is not really something new. The current developments in regard to interactivity, interconnectedness, and real-time experiences provide fundamentally new ways of experiencing, moving through, and acting, and also perceiving public space. And with new technological developments such as AR Kit from Apple or AR Cure from Google, both which were launched 2017, new technological possibilities arise that may affect our perception of public space in the future, for instance, by digital project placement over augmented reality applications. So as you see in this image, you could, for instance, in the future walk down a street with your smartphone or any mobile device in your hand, and with a visible overlay over every door and in the street that's showing you ratings, for instance, or menus of restaurants or prices and products of each shop. And while this commercial use of these technological possibilities need to be critically reflected, AR can also offer new possibilities for the participation of civil society in the formation of virtual public space. And this is where augmented reality art comes in. So what is augmented reality art? One example could be Jeff Koons' globe-spanning augmented reality sculpture project, which he did in collaboration with Snapchat, that allows users to hold up their phone and see his shiny balloon dog, given that they are standing in the right geotagged position, such as you see here, the Central Park in New York. He did this also in other locations, such as the Eiffel Tower in Paris. So all this location had in common that they were highly touristic places and were photographed a lot, so perfect for taking selfies. However, I'm not so much interested in this kind of augmented reality art, because it becomes more interesting if we look at this kind of augmented reality art, which is more kind of augmented reality art activism. Shortly after the announcement of Jeff Koons' augmented reality sculpture project in October 2017, the New York-based artist Sebastian Erazzuri virtually graffiti-bombed Jeff Koons' balloon dog in protest. So this was probably the first augmented reality vandalism ever. And however, Erazzuri did not actually vandalize the Snapchat sculpture directly, because therefore he would have needed the permission of the company of Snapchat or hack into his servers. He did neither of them. Instead, he created together with the CrossLab studio his own app that shows basically a 3D digital recreation of the work on the same geotagged location as Koons' work. So you need to use his app in order to see the vandalism. Before, however, he said that they tried to submit their protest sculpture to Snapchat, but they never even received any response from them. And while this kind of augmented reality activism seems maybe at first sight like a playful digital joke, it also raises important questions regarding and how we deal with virtual public space. And augmented reality differs, as you know, from virtual reality, whereas virtual reality is a complete immersive digital experience entirely created by the computer. Augmented reality is our reality as captured by the lenses of our smartphones or mobile devices, plus a series of 3D elements that overlaid or immersing with the real world as shown on our smartphone displays. And with regard to new technological developments and launches of companies such as Apple and Google, we are moving towards an augmented reality where our daily use of mobile devices maybe will be filled with 3D elements, be it, for instance, for entertainment, information, or advertisement. And as an augmented reality user in the future, we will probably not have to ask or research, for instance, who created the designer chair in the shop window or which ratings the restaurants we would like to go has across the street. We will just use an augmented reality app. And at some point, maybe we will be able to display almost every object in the world, be it consumer goods, restaurants, or any kind of sightseeing, side spots as well, as soon as we capture the object with the camera or locate it via GPS. So this virtual public space will also influence how we will move and perceive real public space. And while this offers new possibilities, it also raises questions about hegemony and authority and about the question who owns virtual public space. Because at the moment, companies such as Snapchat or Google or Apple have the freedom to GPS tag in the public space whatever they want. And with his virtual vandalism, the artist Erasures wants to criticize this unconscious surrender of virtual public space to commercial companies and demands that augmented reality experiences should be governed by similar rules to those renting out physical space. For instance, by getting charged for the use of virtual public space that belongs, in his opinion, to the public and to the people. And in one image of the vandalized artwork, he added even more questions. I will quote them now. He asked, should corporations be allowed to play whatever content they choose over digital public space? Central Park belongs to the city of New York. Why should corporations get to geotag its GPS coordinates for free? We know they will make money renting GPS spots to brands and bombard us with advertisement. They should pay rent. We should choose to approve what can be geotagged to our public space. So this debate may be a few years ahead of the time, but augmented reality advertising in virtual public space could maybe grow to be a major industry. And however, the technological augmented reality also offers new possibilities of democratizing public space, or at least of rethinking power relations and mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion within this field. So the first augmented reality art intervention already took place 2010. The artists duo Sander Wenhoff and Mark Skwarek launched the first augmented reality exhibition at the MoMA in New York without the previous knowledge of the museum, of course. And visitors could use the app in order to discover new augmented reality artworks positioned within the virtual space of the exhibition halls of MoMA in order to point to exclusion mechanism of the museum that also affect our perception of what is canonized as artwork and what is not. And a similar action took place in March this year with the art project Hello, We're from the Internet, that took over also again MoMA's Jackson Pollock room without previous permission. And the artist group idea came basically from the experience that most of the MoMA visitors already seem to primarily see the displayed artwork slowly through the display of their smartphones or mobile devices by taking selfies or pictures of it. And both of these unauthorized augmented reality projects can be described as critical interventions into canonical spaces. And in the framework of the 2011 Istanbul Biennial, the design office PATU, that was founded by Cem Kosa and Ise Ünal, conceptualized the augmented reality art project Invisible Istanbul Urban Dynamics. And it was also an augmented reality walking tour where visitors could see the present display of the city by looking through their smartphone lenses, but they were also overlaid with past architectures and also future development plans, which also points to the challenges of authority and who owns the decisions in public space making. And so the smartphone becomes a viewing instrument to bring into focus forces invisible to the eye and make them visible in the public sphere. And as subversive augmented reality activism, this is another example, may find its root in the so-called détournement of the situationist. This means the artist uses an existing media image and alters it with an AR application in order to point, for instance, to social injustice or any kind of political issues. And one example was this application, The Leak in Your Hometown, which overlaid the British Petroleum logo with an AR broken 3D pipe with smoke and oil leaking out of it. And this was in reaction to the BP oil pipe disaster in the Gulf of Mexico 2009. And the advantage of this AR logo hack is that it affects all the logos of the target entity around the whole world. And another example was this kind of augmented reality application which were used during the Occupy movement. It's called #AR Occupy Wall Street, which was an intervention. And the app was inspired by the inability of the protesters to protest directly in front of Wall Street, as they were only allowed to demonstrate some blocks away. And so in a way of a flash mob, visitors, so general visitors and passers-by went with their smartphones and tablets to the Wall Street and used this app in order to virtually augment the protesters from nearby directly in front of the New York Stock Exchange. So here in this image you can see the real empty street with no protesters, but when you put up your smartphone or tablet, the street is displayed, which is displayed as completely crowded with people who are protesting. And augmented reality art can have the ability to expose also the unseen, which makes it in general interesting for political activism in public space. And this is especially the case in repressive regimes in which the population is systematically denied access to public space and thus to political participation. And AR offers here the possibility of reappropriating public space, even if it's only virtually and only for those who use the devices. And one example could be or is the AR application Tiananmen Squared by the artist group The Four Gentlemen. And it created the Goddess of Democracy statue from the Tiananmen Square in Beijing. The Chinese art students originally created there with chicken wires and plasters during the uprising 1989. And a second example is the iconic image of the tank man on East Shangan Street during the pro-democratic protests. And for both augmentations, they have been placed in Beijing at the precise GPS coordinates where the original incidents took place, and they can also only be watched there with any mobile device. However, since the Chinese cyber police even put everyone under observation who's simply searching for the term Tiananmen Square in the internet while in China, to actually use the app on the location could be now quite risky and result in fines or even jail. So to conclude my examples, these presented augmented reality applications not only provide a framework in which questions about authority, hegemony, or ownership of public space can be raised, they can also draw attention to the respective historical or cultural context of public space. For example, by making visible, forgotten, or long disappeared buildings and architectures in the street and tell their respective story. One key feature of AR is the way in which data is organized and accessed with site specificity. By transforming complex information into manageable visual layouts that can only be seen when one stands in the respective location, AR can also heighten the public's understanding of their physical surroundings, making them more in touch with their world around them. So this can be utilized, as I showed in the beginning, for commercial purposes, but it can also be utilized for the arts and for the preservation of histories. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. I really love the idea of augmented vandalism, so thank you for bringing that. Last but not least, we have Charlie Clemoes. He's a writer, editor, and podcaster, originally from the southwest of England, and currently living in Amsterdam. He's the editor of Fail Architecture and co-hosts the Fail Architecture podcast. He's also part of the Amsterdam-based design platform From Far. Coming from a background in critical urbanism, his work often concerns the role of culture and technology in both reproducing and challenging the way that power is distributed in cities. Welcome.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me? Can people hear me? Yeah. Thanks for having me. So I've been asked to, my talk is obviously entitled, Sorry, This Machine Isn't Working at the Moment. I've been asked to talk about neoliberal urban management structures, augmented, especially as they relate to augmented reality and video games. There's three quite big subjects. I'm probably not going to be able to come up with a unifying theory. Excuse me. All in 15 minutes, but I'll give it a go. You can maybe tie up the loose ends in questions. So I would have quite liked to have explained a little bit, spent a bit of time talking about neoliberalism, but again, don't really have enough time. So yeah, I think in this context, it will probably suffice to say that it's a system, at least in kind of urban management terms, it's a system which encourages the market to insinuate itself into ever more areas of urban life. So this can be through kind of like public privatization of public services, public assets, public space, but also the encouragement of a sort of individual entrepreneurial citizen subject or consumer. The way that augmented reality and video games kind of most obviously kind of contribute to this system is by reinforcing the idea that it is the natural order of things, that there is no alternative to this system. And with that you can kind of, sorry, I'm going to clear my throat again. Excuse me. With that you can kind of introduce the notion of capitalist realism, which was a term popularized by Mark Fisher, the late Mark Fisher, who sadly died in 2016, who chose to explain it in a book of the same name by way of a quote from another critic of postmodernity, Frederick Jameson, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Towards the end of his life, Mark Fisher released a series of articles around the time of the Greek debt crisis, the referendum, the Ochi referendum, but also the 2015 UK general election. They're really great. I mean, one of the ones is where I got this picture from, Democracy is Joy. You can find it on his blog. And he kind of covers quite a lot of subjects, but one thing that really stood out for me was this idea that capitalist realism was failing. It was kind of falling apart, and there were signs of it all the way around the urban landscape. It's actually harder to find these signs in the Netherlands. Everything seems to kind of work a little bit better than London. But anyway, it's probably a bit more insidious, as you'll find. But I was kind of wandering around the the sort of streets of London, but also, I mean, in general, in the UK, everything's kind of broken. Yeah, anyway, I mean, I think this is kind of where I can kind of bring in augmented reality, because I think the potential that augmented reality has is to reinvigorate capitalist realism. And I think it's really well illustrated in a recent piece of video art by Keiichi Matsuda called Hyperreality. I imagine some of you have probably encountered it already. It's, I think if I just do that, yeah, there we go. Ah, there's no sound, great, okay. Well, I mean, I don't think. So anyway, you're kind of treated to a visual overload of kind of exciting, kind of alluring commodities, and then suddenly it cuts out. This is at a particular point, and then it relaunches again. And as I said, I think this this idea kind of, I think you were hearing it towards the end. This video was really interesting. Turn the volume up. Yeah. Did I turn the mute? Did I mute it? I'm not used to apples. It doesn't really matter, honestly. It's fine. Yeah. So this work really, it's useful from my point of view to sort of illustrate my point in two ways. As I said, it has the potential to reinvigorate capitalist realism, but it also shows, and I'll leave this hanging, the prospect of the machine not working, and I think that's a kind of really important thing to hold on to about the kind of potential of augmented reality. It also actually, I mean, incidentally, I'm probably wasting time by bringing this up, but it reminds me of this E.M. Forster book written in the early 1900s, which predicts the internet. I'd really recommend reading it. The machine is this thing that kind of dominates and controls and mediates every aspect of people's existence, and it suddenly kind of develops this ability to... people start thinking that it's a god, but then it suddenly starts breaking and not working, and nobody really knows what to do. Again, I'll leave that hanging. Obviously, the kind of piece of augmented reality everybody kind of is aware of is Pokemon Go, but the company that made it, Niantic, produced a previous game, Ingress, it's called, in 2011. Which I think is more interesting and illustrative of the worrying potential of augmented reality in the urban landscape. I'll just show the video, and hopefully it will actually sound. Okay, this definitely needs sound, I think. But I mean, okay, I can explain Ingress. Basically, there's it's a game where it's like capture the flag. You have to capture portals. You're playing in a massive multiplayer environment. It's location activated, and a lot of the portals are in sort of places of significance. And this guy, he says, places that are important to us as a people. Now, I'm really skeptical about this because, who gets to decide this? Obviously, who gets to decide it is Niantic, who are owned by Google. Google are already doing this. They're directing us to particular parts of the urban landscape that are hyper-commodified. You can imagine this game also doing the opposite and directing us away from places of transgression or decommodified spaces. Anyway, again, I'll leave that there. I think... I've probably got a little bit of, yeah.
Guys, everything's plugged in down here.
Shall I play it? Hey.
Done.
Yeah, nice. Okay, we got it. So anyway, I'm going to quickly turn to video games. Video games have been around for a lot longer, or at least in popular imagination, popular consumption. So they've been doing this for a long time, basically reinforcing neoliberal urban management structures. This is Streets of Rage 2. It's a scrolling beat 'em up. I talk about it in the podcast, a Failed Architecture podcast. Basically, the aim of the game is to cleanse the streets of violent criminals. The criminals are often portrayed as punks, which is a sort of like trope within the early 90s, late 80s films. You don't really find them anywhere, but in culture, punks never really look that ridiculous. But anyway, you only ever see the city through the eyes of this vigilante who's basically coming to clean up the streets, cleanse it of the kind of unsavory elements. You never see things from the punk perspective, and I think, again, I want to kind of hang on to that. And it's really important, like, to see that this is, again, about kind of managing capitalist realism. It's sort of saying, we're above politics. This is just a representation of what it's like in the inner city. And it never really explores the kind of potential that this is a political representation. This is just the natural order of things. And that was then. I mean, I was meant to talk about recent developments in video games, so I can kind of accelerate to a recent game, Tom Clancy's Division 2. The producer of this game, or the creative director, recently said that Ubisoft's video games are not political. I mean, you can read this. They're not political. Politics is bad for business. Now, if you see the imagery of the trailer, you'll realize that it's very clearly political. And this game is essentially a chemical weapons attack has led to the fragmentation of the USA. It's your job to gather together an army and repel an attempt to take over the US government. Again, it's taken for granted that the US is something that needs saving. I highly question that at this moment in time. But also, this idea, basically the bad guys are some rebels that need to be kind of sorted out. It's exactly the same trope as the Streets of Rage. Now, I mean, I've been negative for the whole of this talk, so I'd like to leave on a positive note, because there is really a lot of positive aspects of augmented reality and video games. I'm not going to talk about the augmented reality aspects because Judith covered that really well. Although actually I think it has been going for since the 1990s. There's been like experiments in kind of location-based art that are really, really interesting. Headmap Manifesto is a really great example. Anything from Blast Theory as well. Rider Spoke, where you kind of activate aspects of people's kind of stories in the urban environment. I could go on. But anyway, what I want to say about like what the potential is really nicely illustrated. And I kind of touched upon it about not seeing the punk perspective in Streets of Rage. I always keep turning back to this. It's not really relevant to video games or augmented reality, but the punk ethic essentially in the late 70s was with 3 chords and an attitude and an idea, you could produce something meaningful in culture. And this was a big reaction against particularly prog rock, where it was extremely elaborate, very difficult. You looked at it and you thought, I can't do that. And punk came along and said, anybody can do this. And, after that, it led to a very kind of a blossoming of popular art. Now, I'm seeing the same thing with independent gaming, and I think a really nice example of it is Oikospiel. And I think I'll play it out and talk over it. Now, you'll see almost immediately that it shows the mechanics. It shows that a human creator produced this, and it shows that you can do anything on these platforms, and it's extremely glitchy. I looked at this and I thought, when I first played it, okay, like video games aren't this elaborate thing. You can produce something really interesting that's kind of broken. And this comes back to my original idea of, sorry, this machine isn't working at the moment. I think it's a really nice thing to hold on to, that, like when we're talking about smart cities or augmented reality, maybe we can kind of insinuate a little bit more of the broken edges and things like that, and maybe that will like bring forth a tendency for people to actually start intervening themselves and bringing their own urban experiences to these video games. Anyway, yeah, as I said, I'll leave it running, and it's only for a few more minutes, so that's it. That's me done. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlie. And don't feel forced to be negative, positive. I will like also negative people.
Should I go into down?
Can I invite the speakers to join me and continue the conversation? Yeah, I cannot see them either. They are like an unified mass of. So, now we see them. No, thank you, all of you, for these different perspectives. I think there is much to talk. I wanted to start with Albert. I was thinking about this notion of data police. And it was the first idea that crossed my mind was like, well, but we know that the Greek polis was not at all a very inclusive space. And obviously, this is what we are also seeing in the smart city. Not everyone is able to participate. Not everyone has the skills or the capacity to interact with certain technologies. So first of all, I was curious to know why you decided to use the polis metaphor, and then how you think we have the capacity to make these systems more inclusive for as broader ranges of inhabitants of the city.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this question. To be clear, from our perspective, from modern times, the polis as established by the Greeks falls short in many ways. There was slavery, women didn't have a position there. So it's clearly a polis that we would not like from our modern perspective. But at the same time, if you compare it with the other forms of government that existed in those days, it was very innovative in the sense that many people could get engaged, issues were being discussed. There was the notion of rationality, the notion of deliberation. So many of these notions that could form the building blocks for democracy were established then, even though it was flawed in many ways. And what I feel in modern times, it's again we have to extend the range to which we can form these inclusive democracies, and that is quite challenging because technology plays a key role, and many people have limited knowledge of technology. I've seen some very interesting examples of augmented reality here, so thank you very much for that. But I wasn't even aware of all the things that were happening now. So it goes very fast. So we need citizens that can be involved in more technological issues. And what is happening now to a large extent is that it's becoming a techno-democracy where a very limited group of people with knowledge of these technologies can be engaged. So one of the key challenges for the democracy is to open up these debates about technology to a wider audience. And some of the things that I'm working on with colleagues from the Design Academy in Eindhoven is the idea of adversarial designs, where we open up new, for example, we looked at the notion of robots in court, and we developed some really scary robots, some things that you really would not like. For example, the whole notion of, is somebody telling the truth? That's now established by a judge. A judge is establishing whether somebody's sincere when he says, I'm sorry about the crime I committed. You could say a robot could do that better than a judge, but is that something we want? So by making it very concrete, by developing these adversarial designs, we can open up these technological issues to a broader audience, and we can try to engage them in these discussions, because then we get to the idea of we own the city. I think if we own the city, then we have to establish forms to make a connection between the people and technology.
No, I was also very intrigued by this, what you were saying about developing legitimate forms of authority. I think that's key, because you weren't necessarily speaking about the nation state of the cities, but other forms of governance that will have different type of positions. and through the lens of technology. So following on what you were saying, I was thinking if then it is or should be compulsory to ask everyone to be literate on technology. So it's something that writing, that if you don't write or you don't read, probably you cannot mediate between you and the structures of power and so on. Do you see that possibility, or do you think that rather we have to keep it open and have to have a space for refusal to participate in the digital age?
Well, to be honest, I do feel that it should be part of all education. I know that Adam Greenfield on when was it, Wednesday, argued that that the whole idea that everybody should know code was sort of a neoliberal illusion. But I was thinking about reading and writing, and you could say that reading and writing was also something that was imposed on the people. But I don't think anybody would now say that it's your choice to be an analphabetic, to not being able to read and write. And I think it's the same with being able to do simple calculations. So in many ways, if we want sort of an enlightened form of citizenship, and I do still believe in these forms of enlightenment, it also means that it's a citizenship that is, to a certain degree, technological citizenship. So I would find that the whole idea of these coder dojos and then things where people learn to not be afraid of technology, and also the idea of Arduino, where people sort of appropriate the technology, seem to be very sensible from that perspective. Otherwise, we'll have a form of citizenship that will be disengaged from crucial decisions.
Oh, thank you. And following on that, Judith, totally fascinated by this augmented reality vandalism. So you were pointing to the idea of, should this virtual space, augmented reality spaces, be regulated? Because on the one hand, we see how corporations can actually occupy the public space, but at the same time, it will also maybe regulate these other forms of resistance and subversions that are happening. So how do you position yourself? What do you think?
I think it's an interesting question. I was also, I found it also interesting that these kind of artists or interventionists and augmented reality activists by themselves, that they give a call for regulation, which Sebastian Errázuriz actually agrees or at least points to the necessity of regulation in any case. But how this regulation needs to be to put together, I agree totally with Albert in this regard, that it needs to, it's a difficult question and a difficult issue which needs to be agreed upon the general people. But what I found interesting in this kind of augmented reality activism, that in a media historical perspective, it totally remembers me at this video activist in the late 1960s, early 1970s, who used a new medium, which was video at that time, who used the Sony Porter Park to the street to reappropriate public space, which they thought the mainstream TV media at that time show in a wrong or not in the correct perspective to democratize public space with the new medium in order to bring people to rethink the media influence critically. And I found it very interesting. I was thinking at a quote from Nam June Paik. I think he said it in the end of 1960s. TV attacked us our all-day life, and now we are able to and have the means to attack back or to fight back. And I think this is a very interesting and activist spirit, which I saw in this augmented reality artworks as well, and also aesthetically. I mean, they are still in their infant shoes. As was video in the late 60s as well. Maybe not so much aesthetically pleasant, but still to give triggers to people to rethink. And I think that's also, when we're talking about regulations, a very important aspect to really rethink and reflect on the challenges we have. And before we come up with some sort of regulation, we should first rethink this kind of challenges.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this, and because most of the examples that we have seen today through you, not with Charlie. I like that was a bit more negative. But were from artists that were activists or social initiatives that were bottom up. But obviously, in that space of virtual space, even in the city, not every citizen has good intentions. We are surrounded, or many even here, I don't know, like people who has different opinions from a leftist, inclusive, and non-racist positions. So what it means, regulation, who has to be regulated? Only corporations, on how the bias that is inherited in the technology that we are using, and also how we overcome the fact that citizen initiatives not necessarily have the best intentions ever. We can also see how certain symbols in virtual reality from fascist regimes or ideas of racist, homophobic, or macho-oriented practices could also start occupying those spaces. So I would like to ask the three of you, in relation to regulation, the capacity to be free-spaced, and also the idea that not every user has very open-minded about what the space should be.
Personally, can people hear me? I'm not sure if I'm being amplified or not, but I believe in democracy as the sort of cornerstone of a kind of future society. So like, I mean, I just think like essentially it's a sort of it's about actually freedom in every kind of way. The idea of regulation is obviously like very much a part of that. I mean, my ideas are maybe a bit scattered, but I think like there was like an interesting moment at the beginning of the internet that's definitely passed, and it's about the fact that there's kind of uneven distribution of power in terms of the kind of control of resources. Democracy doesn't really exist in the society we live in. In the capitalist mode of production, it's because we're kind of mediated by wage labor and private property, there's obviously people that have more power than others, and it's not democratic, so that people don't have control over their lives. So in terms of regulating, I mean, like, sorry, I'm kind of rambling now, but like in terms of regulating, I would say, I mean, we're already regulating in favor of corporations, and if we really want to kind of sort of like achieve a society where people have control over their lives, then the regulation has to be to regulate them out of existence.
Any other thoughts?
Well, maybe to approach it from a little bit of a different angle. I've looked quite a bit at the use of WhatsApp and other simple technologies by citizens to increase the security of their neighborhoods, and I think that's a very sort of interesting phenomenon because it has the two sides of it. On the one hand, you could say, well, the disengaged citizen that maybe will call the police when something's happening, or maybe will just not do anything and wait for the police to intervene, is, I think, quite undesirable. So we want citizens to assume some responsibility for what's happening around them. If somebody would be harassed, we sort of expect the bystanders to help us out and to take action. At the same time, some of these citizen groups become the vigilante groups that sort of feature in the video game that you showed in your presentation, where they really walk around and intervene, and if there's some people with a North African background standing on the streets, feel they need to intervene and tell them to move on because people feel unsafe. So that is sort of a scary side of it. And what we see happening now is that the police are looking for ways to connect to these citizen initiatives by becoming members of these WhatsApp groups, so that they can sort of redirect their action in a sort of, well, generally seen as desirable direction, but at the same time give them some sense of ownership. And well, those are the complexities, I think, of a modern-day democracy. We don't want the institutions to take full control because it disempowers us, but at the same time, we also do not want all individuals to take full control because, as you correctly said, there are some scary individuals out there. So that's sort of the thing that we need to be looking for, And the way I always see it, it's sort of about the connection between the institution and the individual initiative, and that's shifting over time, and we need to reconsider that every time and again. But in these practices, that really shows. And I think, at least in the Netherlands, the police are finding some good ways to sort of redirect these initiatives in a sort of more desirable direction.
What seems interesting as well is that we are always talking about regulating even the virtual space from the same type of rules that regulate the existing, like, urban physical space, right? And I'm always laughing about the fact that even in different video games or different platforms in the augmented reality, we play with the same logics that govern the world, like, you design a house and you put a door, whereas, like, you don't need that precisely in the public space in the digital world, and so on. So how will be a possibility to imagine different regulations or different forms of participating in the public space that are not connected at all with the physical space?
One thing, speaking to someone who knows a lot more about this than I do, Hannah Nicklin, she kind of put it well, and I think it's kind of something that's picked up on by, I think it's one of the main arguments that Adam Greenfield talks about. Providing, like, video games, for instance, providing a kind of route into as useful tools for systems literacy, she says. The idea that, like, again, you can kind of really experiment with cracks and kind of have, like, intervention in a way that, like, is not really possible in the urban environment, and begin to instill in people the idea that systems aren't there to sort of regulate them necessarily, but, like, are things that they can actively kind of engage in to sort of to manipulate and to sort of, like, articulate their own experiences through that and organize through that. I think that's, like, it's as a testing ground, I suppose. She also sort of talks about, the fact that you have to design the fact that gravity works in video games. So do you want gravity to work? Why do we want gravity to work? And these kind of things, like, if you're forced to question the fundamental sort of rules that govern everything, the technical rules that govern the way that we live in everyday life, then suddenly everything becomes up for grabs. I think that can really instill a sort of an activist mindset in people. That's a useful thing about video games.
If I can follow up on that, I think Evgeny Morozov makes a very similar argument when he argues for sort of open gaming environments, because one of the key problems with games, and I think that Charlie indicated as well, is that what is real is established by the game designer, and in the same sense that we sort of socially construct our world in real life, the social construction of the virtual world even opens up many more possibilities, like having another type of gravity. So the sense that establishing what is real should also be one of the questions in this virtual environment is of course very, very interesting, and it requires quite a different perspective on games. Well, to make a connection, I've been working with the city of Rotterdam, and they're talking about what they call a digital twin. And one of their key points is that these digital twins will probably increasingly play a role, and probably two of you know much more about it. But their argument is the digital twin should actually also be public space. And if we're not going to do it, then Facebook or some other company is going to come in and construct a digital twin of Rotterdam, and then this will be commercial space and not public space. So. But it's quite challenging because, of course, they don't have the capacity to develop these worlds like Facebook or some of the other tech companies have. But the sense to what this space is and who controls it is very, very interesting. And it raises a set of new, I think the whole idea of establishing collective rules still applies. But what these rules are is much broader than it was before.
I'm going to open it to the audience, but before I have a pressing question, because we are talking about cities and data. But obviously, when we talk about cities, we talk about infrastructure. So I was also very intrigued, Judith, by these forms of protest that were showing BP and were like trying to subvert this image. But at the same time, I was looking at how a person holding an iPhone or a phone that, the construction of the systems that allow for that technology to exist are highly unequal as well, are based on exploitative practices. So every component that is in the iPhone is not exactly very sustainable. So there was a paradox in that image somehow. What do you think? Because in a way, we use these spaces and technologies to make, react to certain practices, but at the same time, the technology itself is based on infrastructure that might be also perpetuating those structures.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point you put to, and I think this also needs to be critically reflected. And I'm thinking at the moment, cannot pick up now an example of an artwork who does this, but in general, I've found it interesting when I come back to Sebastian Errázuriz, who did this augmented reality vandalism. What he was arguing for regulation was probably mainly to commercial use of virtual public space. So also the question again of ownership, and I think this is something interesting when we think about public space, what means public space for democracy, how we could use virtual public space in this regard, and maybe we take public space and to be able to assemble in a public space for granted, but it's not in, for instance, in repressive regimes. So in repressive regimes, one first task a regime does is to deny people access to public space. How they do this, for instance, that public spaces become not a space, but more an car highway or something like this, where you're not able to gather. This is something I think where augmented reality applications or this kind of interventions, which I show, maybe are a means to trigger this kind of reflections. But of course, they should also rethink their medium by itself. And I think this is something which maybe still needs to be done. Coming back to this video activist, which I mentioned, they also in that time they thought if everyone has at that time his Potter Park and can show the world his opinion about the world, then we have then we have real democracy. But now everyone has his smartphone, everyone can tell the world what he does, but this whole data collecting and surveillance issues which we have now, they didn't reflect at that time because they could not. The technology was not there yet. So I think also for this kind of very new forms of augmented reality activism, also to reflect their own medium, is something crucial. Yeah.
Okay, at the beginning I said that I wanted you to participate in the conversation. Obviously I was lying because we have 5 minutes left, but hopefully if you are very direct in the questions and you are very short and brief in the answers, we have time for several questions. So who wants to ask something to our speakers? Oh, now you don't have any question. Really? Oh, I see one.
Hi, thank you for that. I guess I'm just trying to still wrap my head around the idea of augmented reality in this question of public space when actually, as it mostly exists now, it's still a very private interface, being on your personal cell phone or tablet or perhaps headset if you have something fancy like that. So I'm not really sure if I totally understand let's say, all the problematics coming from, especially this conversation about, let's say, Central Park or something like this, having, problematics in having personal ownership over what you choose in terms of an artistic practice to view on your own cell phone. So maybe we could just kind of continue unpacking this idea of private versus public space through the interface of technology.
Okay, yes, I agree. I mean, the reason of where the interconnectedness is between the real public space and the virtual public space is with this augmented reality applications, actually, you need to stand in the public space you need to stand in the right geotag position in order to see it. You won't be able to see the artwork if you're just looking for it in your computer at home, so you need to be there. And I think one thing also this activists like to use this form of new medium is also that or enhance, for instance, in any kind of digital social media debates, to enhance this with augmented reality interventions, is that the site specificity with people in the room, it's scientifically proven that people who use augmented reality in the space, that they emotionally are affected more or are emotionally triggered more by any kind of topic than if they only read about it on their smartphone at any place. And one instance, you're totally right, at the moment it's still a private issue. You are only able to see the artwork on your display. But there is also new technological developments who maybe also will trigger or formate a new network that also there will be an interconnectedness with this kind of augmented reality applications. So also in this case, you have a virtual public space to meet other people, not only to be yourself with your smartphone. So there are some interconnectedness which trigger, but this still, it's a future talk. At the moment, still augmented reality, I mean, with the exception maybe of the Snapchat pictures or Pokemon Go, people in general don't use augmented reality yet in general in all their life, I would say. Most of the people not. It's still not mainstream. So that's just a thing which the artists like to discuss for future. So it's, yeah.
Any other thoughts?
I mean, what about like private and public space? This idea of like enclosing spaces that haven't actually been kind of used yet. I suppose there's like a kind of, again, it's sort of about like taking for granted the idea that, oh, of course, like, you know, these spaces will be kind of something that can be sold off. I mean, this is, you know, like the cradle of capitalism, right? It's like enclosing more and more spaces and kicking off people who are kind of there, who are there already. I think like I guess the fear or the concern is that the people with the most sort of technological firepower are going to be able to kind of just like take control of all of it, right? I mean, I'm not really saying anything particularly mind-blowing, but in terms of like private space, I suppose it's yeah, it's about like not taking for granted the fact that we have all access to it, even though we're not all using it. Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, we have to finish in this negative note. I love, Charlie, and your negativity, because talking about regulation of the public space, I have someone telling me, stop.
Negative way to end.
I'm kidding. So thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you very much to all of you. And one thing. To end in a more positive note, you can all play an augmented reality game in the foyer that is called Patternist. And you can download it in your iPhone from 6th onwards. So maybe that gives you a more, positive experience of public space. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Thanks.